Pyrrhus is famous, but almost indirectly, because everybody knows the expression Pyrrhic victory. You know, if you've got any interest in warfare at all, you know about the battle that's won, but at too high a cost to make it viable. In antiquity, he was one of the most famous, most admired commanders. These days, we know less about him because the sources haven't survived, and we know that he lost. So he goes down a little bit like a Robert E. Lee or a Napoleon who's brilliant but loses in the end, without ever quite achieving as much as they did.
It is, I think, true that the ancient veneration of Pyrrhus is much greater, it seems, than kind of his modern reception. No, I'd be inclined to actually rank him pretty low. And again, some of it is, you know, he doesn't have the capacity to really think about what he's fighting a war for. Is it for conquest? Is it for glory? Is it for loot? And that both characterizes his kind of, you know, again, sort of almost distractified campaigns.
There is something that seems almost fickle about him, the way he bounces around from one campaign to another. In a sense, you have to remember that Pyrrhus is famous as a man who doesn't really achieve very much in the long run. And although he wins battles, he doesn't seem to be able to use them. You know, it's almost the, probably apocryphal, but the Hannibal quote Livy gives us about Hannibal. You know how to win a victory, you don't know how to use it.
My name is Michael Taylor. I'm an assistant professor of ancient history at the University at Albany. I work primarily on the Middle Roman Republic. I guess maybe if the question is, you know, how do we use ancient history to inform our understanding? I would, on one hand, say very, very cautiously, right? I mean, there is, you know, nothing about studying ancient military history gives any kind of immediate guidance to what should be America's policy in the Middle East. It simply can't. I sort of treat ancient history, again, less as case studies, you know, in the way that, say, a business school might say, well, here's a case study, and because of this is how you should think about your business. Again, I don't think Pyrrhus tells us anything about, you know, what our policy vis-a-vis Pakistan should be. But again, I think that it is useful for providing a kind of perspective on, you know, what I would actually say is a real problem with the way that our kind of military and then kind of as it structures into kind of national security is, you know, the U.S. is like Pyrrhus in a lot of ways. We're great at winning battles. We're great at long-term operations. And yet we struggle to articulate strategy in some areas. Or our strategy sometimes is over-informed by, say, tactics. And so, like I said, I think in that sense, Pyrrhus is useful for, you know, how not to think about war. Someone who only thinks about war as the next battle, the next campaign, the next operation, and, you know, doesn't really ever pause to actually think about, you know, why we're fighting. I mean, there's a famous set of exchanges between Pyrrhus and one of his drinking buddies, and again, kind of a sympathetic context, and it essentially, you know, says, well, you know, Pyrrhus, what are we going to do after we beat so-and-so? And it literally is, well, we're going to fight, you know, Romans, and then we fight the Romans, we'll fight the Carthaginians, and then a whole list of other peoples that we can beat. And then finally, when they sort of run out of peoples they can think of to defeat, the drinking buddy says, well, you know, what then? And Pyrrhus says, well, then we'll just have nothing else to do, and we can kick back, and we can drink, and it'll be great. And the drinking buddy says, well, why don't we just do that now? Like, why, you know, why bother with all of this war? And I think that's one reason why, you know, despite being revered in the ancient world as a military genius, he really has nothing to show for it. But, you know, it also goes to how little many ancients kind of thought of or valued sort of grand strategic thinking. You know, if you're a Roman consul, or even a Greek annual general, you may not actually engage in much strategic thinking. You just have to take your army and lead them somewhere, and your year in office is ticking down. And in that sense, thinking about how Pyrrhus, crossed the Adriatic and managed to land and get his troops together, might be worth thinking about, even if you don't necessarily step back and say, wow, he fought all those years and accomplished nothing and then got killed, which is again, there's a kind of very nihilistic way to think about Pyrrhus. Military history is actually a rare form of history that is potentially vocational, and that people who are either in the military or who work on national security issues oftentimes find it useful to think about history, to kind of provide a useful perspective for their own thinking and decision making. And war without any kind of strategic aim or vision is easy and done a lot. And in some ways, I think Pyrrhus is a good ancient example of someone who's really good at tactics, really good at operations, good at moving, commanding armies, seems to be charismatic, liked by his friends, and yet because of a total lack of strategic vision, basically fails everywhere. Never holds on to Macedonia. The Romans take southern Italy. The Carthaginians quickly reestablish themselves in Sicily, and Pyrrhus himself is then gets a tile dropped on his head. That's the end. And I think it's actually worth treating him as a cautionary tale for what happens when you don't even ask a why about the war. And I think that's as we think about how we train senior officers in the military who are by and large good at tactics and good at operations, and how do we actually think about strategy as we think about what our kind of national security establishment, who again oftentimes are also very good at local objectives but aren't, I think, as effective on strategy. I think Pyrrhus is just good, almost is best as a cautionary tale. Here's a guy who's a brilliant fighter, and he wastes kind of everything. And ironically, it's the Romans who at least are maybe general per general or army per army at this point aren't as good as Pyrrhus, but they know what they want. They know it's not only essential to their system, they decide that they want it, and they pursue it doggedly, and they achieve it, which is hegemony over southern Italy. It's not genius grand strategy, but it's a vision that seems to be broadly shared by the Roman kind of political class. Compared to that, to Pyrrhus's just sort of wanderlust, it's quite stark.